Hello and welcome. This is Wilrens for Create a Learning Site, the place to go deeper in your understanding of the Bible. I should have read this book much sooner. Bruce Winter, Roman Wives, Roman Widows, The Appearance of New Women in the Pauline Communities, which was published in 2003. It provides crucial background information on the life of women in the first century, and in doing this, it illuminates several difficult and controversial passages in the New Testament. Bruce Winter's lifelong passion has been to build a bridge between the study of classical antiquity, that is, the world of ancient Greece and Rome, and the study of the New Testament. One would think that this is an obvious connection to make, seeing that the Greco-Roman world forms the setting and background of the entire New Testament, but Winter noticed that biblical scholars are often ignorant of developments and discoveries made by their colleagues in institutes and departments of classical studies. In his writings, he therefore presents relevant information and applies it to the field of biblical studies. What moved me to finally read his book is that I taught 1 Corinthians last November, and therefore once again had to face the issue of head covering in 1 Corinthians 11. This includes questions about what would have been considered normal or proper, as well as questions about what the Corinthians, or at least some of their women, were doing differently and why. But first things first, who were these new women referred to in the subtitle of Winter's book? What was new about them? How did they depart from what was considered normal or proper in Roman society? And how did the Roman authorities react? We are on relatively firm ground when it comes to the norm. In public, Roman women of sufficient status who were married would normally wear a head covering that covered most of their hair but not their face, as in the illustration here. To speak of a veil may therefore leave us with the wrong impression. They would also, especially if they were upper class, wear a stola, an elaborate garment that prostitutes and adulterous women were forbidden to wear. It's shown in the next illustration. It shows a statue of Empress Livia, the wife of Emperor Augustus. Official Roman statues, like the one shown here, clearly reflect the standard of modesty and dress that the Roman authorities wanted to promote. The head covering was meant to express this value of modesty. As Bruce Winter puts it, the veiled head was the symbol of the modesty and chastity expected of a married woman. Defining female virtues this way goes a long way back. It hardly differs from what the ancient Greeks expected of their women. Much of it could be summed up in one word, sophrosyne. The word is often translated as temperance, but it implies chastity and self-restraint as well. As Sarah Pomeroy points out, it was the preeminent virtue of Greek women. It's used more frequently than any other term on women's tombstones. There was then a dress code for respectable married women, just as there was one for prostitutes. Roman law distinguished between them by means of their dress and adornment. People could be recognized and categorized by what they were. In the words of Thomas McGinn, in classical antiquity, you were what you wore. Prostitutes came in two kinds. Pornai were ordinary prostitutes who worked on the streets or in brothels and who might serve many clients. Hetairai were expensive upper-class prostitutes or courtesans. They were often well educated and provided companionship as well as sexual pleasure. They would typically be invited to and participate in upper-class dinner parties. Neither Hetairai nor Pornai would wear a head covering or a stola. They would also stand out, especially the Hetairai, by the sumptuous use of jewelry, gold, pearls, and cosmetics, as well as by elaborate hairstyles. Again, you were what you wore, and this would be obvious at first sight. Already in the 1st century before Christ, things had begun to change. Especially upper-class women and those with financial means enjoyed a new measure of opportunity, and some of them began to take more freedoms, including sexual freedom. Some cast aside all restraints and embraced a lifestyle of promiscuity, even if they were married. They were, in the words of Bruce Winter, a new breed of wives whose lifestyle differed considerably from that of the traditional image of the modest wife. Their example proved enticing to some women in the provinces who followed in their footsteps. Now, we should not think of the new women as a form or forerunner of modern-day feminism. It was not about rights or a more equitable treatment of women. Its idea of liberation was the total rejection of all restraints, including those most people would consider reasonable and beneficial. It did not promote emancipation, but excessive and often sexual hedonism. Parallel to this, young upper-class men, consisting of patricians and equites or knights, were increasingly postponing marriage and having children, in some cases indefinitely. Rome depended on this class for military and other leadership. Their reluctance to produce offspring therefore posed a long-term threat to the stability of the empire. Their birth rate was too low. The availability of women apart from marriage did not help. Emperor Augustus responded with new legislation. As early as 17 BC, he introduced extensive legislation against licentiousness and in favor of marriage. In it, he prescribed moral conduct. There were financial disadvantages introduced in remaining single. Those who had children had better career opportunities. There was a dress code formulated for wives. Marriage between certain classes was prohibited, and when husbands remained inactive when their wives committed adultery, they too became liable to punishment. Punishments could be stiff. People could lose half their property and suffer banishment. Adulterous wives were not allowed to wear the marital head covering or stola, exposing them to shame, public shame. A husband had to initiate proceedings against his unfaithful wife within 60 days. Condoning adultery also became a crime. The dress code, by the way, was strongly anchored in Roman law. If a woman did not wear the marital head covering and therefore looked like a prostitute, the man who unwittingly committed adultery with her was not liable. After all, you were what you wore. Upper-class males without children faced consequences in inheritance law. Their share of the inheritance was significantly cut back, and in career opportunities, those with children were promoted faster. However, it proved hard to pressure young men into marrying. Amendments were introduced in AD 9. The maximum time period to be engaged was limited to 2 years. Girls could only get engaged starting at 10 years of age. They could marry starting at 12 years. This was to prevent young men from getting engaged to very young girls and remain engaged for many years to avoid marriage and having children, so they could enjoy their freedom. Statues of Livia, wife of Augustus, displaying her as the ideal wife and mother, as shown before, were likewise used to counter the development in society. To little avail, it appears, because their own daughter, Julia, was a prime example of a new woman. In 2 BC, she was banished by Emperor Augustus for her rampant adultery and sexual license. A number of her lovers were banished as well. Back to 1 Corinthians 11, we should be aware that Corinth at this time was a Roman city. After its destruction in 146 BC, it had been rebuilt by Julius Caesar in 44 BC as a Roman colony and as a location to settle his veterans on their retirement from the army. Although by Paul's time many of its inhabitants would have been Greek, it followed to a significant extent Roman customs and Roman law. Interestingly, whereas the language on the street no doubt was mostly Greek, the vast majority of inscriptions that have been found in Corinth are in Latin. Bruce Winter concludes that the existence of a New Women movement, quote, supports the interpretation that the wives praying and prophesying with their heads uncovered in the Christian gathering were replicating the attitude and actions of new wives. Based on the legal dress code, removal of the head covering in public made a woman look like, quote, the promiscuous married woman, for the absence of the veil sent an unmistakable signal. It was not proper by first century standards to do this. Worse, quote, the way that wives dressed in public sent clear signals to men, thereby presenting themselves as either immodest or promiscuous women. So in other words, whether it was their intent or not, they signaled they were sexually available. They were what they wore. The background information presented in Winter's book also illuminates 1 Timothy 2. For one, the women causing trouble in the Ephesian church at that time probably took their inspiration from the new women and dressed, and some perhaps behaved, like hetairai. Quote from 1 Timothy 2, I desire then that women should adorn themselves in respectable apparel, with modesty and self-control, that is sophrosune, not with braided hair and gold or pearls or costly attire, but with what is proper for women who profess godliness, with good works. This means that Paul is not pronouncing a ban on all jewelry and the use of cosmetics in moderation, but he's speaking out against dressing like a prostitute or an adulterous wife. I guess that part, different from wearing a head covering, is not culturally relative, but still applies today. It is a bit of a digression, but the issue is of such importance that I do not want to pass it by. Right in the middle of Paul's argument on head covering in 1 Corinthians 11 stands his conclusion, the application he draws. Verse 10. It states the very thing he wants the Corinthians to do. However, it is not at all what we would expect Paul to say at this point. It is also difficult to understand. What makes it worse? The verse is usually translated wrongly. What we would expect Paul to say, based on his argument in the rest of this passage, is that is why a woman ought to wear a head covering. I'm leaving out the additional puzzle of because of the angels. What we get in the ESV translation is that is why a wife ought to have a symbol of authority on her head. Now, this introduces such heavy interpretation into the translation as to completely disfigure what Paul really said. First, throughout 1 Corinthians 11, Paul uses the Greek word for woman, which can also mean wife, depending on context. The ESV moves back and forth between woman and wife as translation. Each choice may or may not be correct, but we should realize that choosing between woman and wife is a matter of interpretation, not translation. More seriously, there is no word for symbol in the Greek original. It only refers to authority. This comes as a surprise since Paul has obviously been speaking of some visible head covering. The ESV and numerous other translations therefore interpret authority, something one cannot see, here as a metonymy, a term that stands for and interprets a different term, in this case, the head covering. The latter is then understood as a sign that a wife is under her husband's authority, therefore she ought to have such a sign, that is, a head covering, on her head. Now, what speaks against this interpretation is not only the absence of any word meaning symbol. We have already posited that the head covering more likely signifies a wife's modesty. Besides, the word authority in Greek, especially when it comes to having authority, is always used in an active sense. It is something one has and may exercise, not something one is under. In addition, the Greek is quite clear. She does not have this authority on her head, but over her head. The woman is in charge of her head. Surprising as this may be, that's what Paul actually says. A better translation would therefore be, that is why a woman ought to have authority over her head. It may be that Paul is conceding a Corinthian argument at this point, in the sense that, yes, a woman has authority over her head, but, more likely in my view, Paul is telling the women to take and exercise authority over their heads, but to do so the right way, not in independence but in consideration of others, especially their husbands. The astounding fact remains that Paul does not deny their authority, but acknowledges it. He merely wants them to use it responsibly, but the responsibility and the authority are theirs.
The show will be starting in just a few moments. Thank you for your patience. The show will be starting in just a few moments. Thank you for your patience. The show will be starting in just a few moments. Thank you for your patience.